We have a theme. Every year we pray for God to give us some wisdom, some direction on how we can use some of our resources and our time management to accomplish God's purpose in Life Church, through Life Church, and into our communities. And so in January, if you were here in January, we introduced the theme for 2023 for this year, and it was for the city. For the city. Can you say it out loud with me? For the city, right? For the city. So we asked God to give us a heart that was for the city, but not just like the city infrastructure, but for the people of the city. And not just for the people of this city, but for the people of the cities that make up Life Church. And we asked God to give us a heart for the people of the cities, not just of Ellis County or Dallas County or Tarrant County or Johnson County, but we asked God to give us a heart for the people of the cities of the world. And so we spent the entire month of January talking about what would it be like to be on mission with Jesus, a mission where he came to seek and save the lost. That's what we talked about in January, and so many of you perhaps are new since January. In fact, Midlothian School District announced that they had over 1,200 new students registered this summer to be enrolled in school. That's a lot of new families. If you put, let's just say there's an average of 2 students per family unit, 1,200 students, that means 600 new families have enrolled children into school this summer. So that's a lot of new people, and perhaps I'm looking around, and maybe you're new, not just to Midlothian, but maybe you're new here to Life Church. And so we're going to take this Sunday and next Sunday, and I just want to kind of reboot and just hit that reset button on what is it that God spoke to us in January, and how can we direct our heart to run after God's heart. So when I say we want to reach the people of the city, first thought, sometimes we think of how large numbers are. If you just look right up the road to the city of Dallas, I think we're forecasted to be the number 4th and soon to be the number 3rd largest city, metropolitan area in the United States. And you think of just the sheer numbers, and you think of how impossible some of those things might be. You might even remember, let me take you back, for those of you that remember, to September 12th, 1962. Some of you might remember 1962, when President John F. Kennedy declared that the United States would send a rocket to the moon. When he spoke those words, the metal alloys that were necessary in order to withstand the incredible heat of leaving orbit and coming back into Earth, those metal alloys had not even been invented yet. It took someone with the ability to see something that hadn't been done to risk saying something that people were going to judge him at his words, to say, we will send a rocket and people to the moon. The metal necessary to construct a space shuttle hadn't yet been invented yet. It seemed like an impossible task. But 7 years later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended off those steps, stepped foot onto the moon, and declared those famous words that we have heard so many times: one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It took one person seeing an impossibility and thinking it was possible. I just want to say, perhaps to you, seeing your family saved, like we just spent a few moments praying, might seem impossible. But even Jesus said, what's impossible for man is possible for God. Jesus loves the lost of our cities so much. And what might seem like culturally impossible or morally impossible or politically impossible or socially impossible or academically impossible or financially impossible, it is possible with God. And I just want to stay in that vein for just a moment, because I want you to understand, with God, all things are possible, and he loves the people of our cities more than we could ever imagine. It was Jesus' last words he gave to the 12 disciples, 11 disciples at that point, and he was been dubbed into the Great Commission. He came to seek and save the lost, and he entrusted to them the message to go and take the gospel around the world. What eventually became the early church in the book of Acts. And here we are 2,000 years later, still on mission with Christ. When we think about reaching the world, it can almost seem scary, it can seem intimidating, it can almost seem impossible. Reaching a world that's ravaged by wars and natural disasters. Reaching a world where 24% of the world lives on less than $1 a day. A world that faces poverty, malnutrition, and food scarcity. Living on less than $1 a day. More than 32% of the world's gross world product is related to dark business, things like money laundering, gambling, organized crime, drug trafficking, pornography, human trafficking, and child exploitation. To reach a world that's spinning out of control, we have to be committed to the cause of Christ, to be a church that's for the city. And to be a church that's for the city, we have to be willing to see with eyes of faith. We have to be willing to see what hasn't been done yet. We have to have faith to see what hasn't been accomplished yet. In Numbers chapter 13, there's this great story, Caleb and Joshua. If you know the story, the nation of Israel has left being enslaved in Egypt. They're headed towards the promised land. They're at the brink of entering into this land that God has promised to be their inheritance. They send 12 spies in to go check out the land. And they come back. 10 of the spies are fearful. It's fortified. There's walls surrounding the cities that they can't seem to penetrate. There's armed men. There's soldiers that are ready for battle. 10 of the 12 spies come back scared. 2 of the 12 spies thought conquering Canaan was possible. When 10 saw giants, 2 saw the size of the grapes they could inherit. In fact, Caleb said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." There are 2 men who had eyes of faith. They saw with eyes of faith what could be. And I think a key that makes the Assemblies of God missions and missionaries successful is that they see with eyes of faith. They don't allow setbacks, or they don't allow political lines. They don't allow financial status or cultural barriers or language difficulties keep them from doing the new things that God has opened doors for them to accomplish, to reach the lost with the good news of Jesus Christ. I think it's eyes of faith that helped us see Life Church before there ever was a Life Church. It was eyes of faith that leveraged 17 people having a Bible study in the living room of our home, that began to answer the question, what would happen if we simply said yes to Jesus to venture into some uncharted territories and try to reach our community with the love of Christ with the most tangible and real way possible? It was eyes of faith that moved those 17 people into Long Branch Elementary School for 3.5 years. And I'm looking around, and some of you guys were here with us in those elementary days. It was eyes of faith that moved us from our elementary school days, being portable church, setting up and tearing down, to moving on to this property and that metal building for the very first time. It was eyes of faith that helped us see Life Church before there ever was a Life Church. We have to live life through the lens of eyes of faith. Eyes of faith don't see how difficult problems are. They see how big our God is. You need to write that down, because you might be facing an impossibility in your life right now. Eyes of faith don't see how impossible the job is. Eyes of faith see how big your God is. An example of someone who lives with eyes of faith, obviously, as we look through the Gospels, is Jesus. But he didn't just stop with eyes of faith and just looking and seeing. He also moved and walked and acted. And I want to just take you to a familiar story here. How Jesus walked in the same world we walked in, and how he had eyes of faith. I want to talk to you for just a moment about his desire to touch with a heart of compassion. To touch with a heart of compassion. We pick up the story in Mark chapter 1 at the very end of the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 40 says, "And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity." In fact, you can circle that or underline that and write on the margin of your Bible or in your notes. Another translation says, "moved with compassion." Compassion. I want to talk to you today about the touch of compassion. Moved with, we can say, compassion. He stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Two thoughts in this story real quick. First, he turned to see the leper and he was moved with compassion. He turned to see the leper and what he saw moved him with compassion. Now, you and I, we're often probably tempted to look at the outward appearance and to judge somebody by their looks, to judge the book by the cover. And I think that kind of starts early in life where we just judge people by their outward appearance. It happened to a friend of mine. He's got a little daughter in elementary school, and she came home from school one day and kind of quiet. She sat down on the couch next to her dad and kind of leaned into him. And then finally looked up and said, "Daddy, do you think I'm pretty?" And the dad said, "Absolutely. I think you're beautiful. Why do you ask?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she finally said, "Well, Daddy, the kids at school were talking about all the pretty girls, and they didn't say my name." Can you feel the pain of a little girl? Can you feel her pain? That's compassion. That's something that stirs inside of our heart. That's something that stirs inside of us. That's compassion. 10 times in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 10 times in the Gospels, it uses the word compassion. And all 10 times of the use of the word compassion is tied directly to Jesus. He's the only one and recorded in the Gospel stories that responded with compassion. He responded with compassion to the sick, to the blind, to the demon-possessed, to those who had lost a loved one, to the hungry, to the lonely, to the bewildered. What that means to me, what that means to us, is when Jesus hurts, when people hurt. That's what being moved with compassion is. Jesus hurts when people hurt. And it bothered him to see people suffering. It bothered Jesus to see people in need. And so when this man comes up and he's saying, "If you will, could you please help me?" Like, don't get in such a hurry to get beyond this point. I think this is a really familiar story and we tend to kind of glaze over it, but don't jump ahead. Because it's easy to say, well, Jesus cared. Of course Jesus cared. But don't take it for granted. Because it's so easy to see the pain and the anguish and the despair and the hurt. It's so easy to see all of that and not be moved with compassion. Perhaps do we do that every day? Perhaps even this week. Maybe watching the news of horrific wildfires in Hawaii where over 100 people's lives have been lost. And we listen to that, we watch that on the news, we see the devastation, and then we keep eating our dinner. We read about bombs and missiles falling from the sky in Ukraine, demolishing schools and residential areas, and we just keep scrolling through social media. It's so easy to watch and see and hear all the pain and all the anguish around the world and just have a barrier between us and not be moved with compassion. If we're moved as Jesus is moved with compassion, then we'll attempt the impossible. If we're moved with compassion that moved Christ, then we'll plant more churches. If we're moved with the compassion that moved Christ, then we'll invest in our kingdom builder partners. If we're moved with the compassion that moved Christ, then we'll be a little more bold with our witness when we go to school and the marketplace. We'll attempt the impossible. Because I told you, Jesus saw the leper and was moved with compassion, but he didn't stop simply with the feelings of compassion. Second, his compassion led him to action. He didn't just stop with the feelings. He reached out and he touched the leper. He literally physically reached out and touched the leper. To me, that talks about the human need that we all have to be touched. To be touched. Do you remember the first time you held someone's hand? Just go back in your mind for just a moment. Do you remember the first time you held someone's hand? I remember Mom and Dad are here, and I don't even know if you know this story or not. I forgot that you guys were going to be here. But I was in 7th grade at Lincoln International School in Buenos Aires, and there's this cute girl named Stacy. She was in 8th grade. Problem was she had a boyfriend already. Yeah, his name was Dio. Like, how cool of a name is that? D-I-O, Dio. I can't compete with that. Dio. And one day, Stacy and Dio broke up. Yeah, the Lord is moving. And we're walking down the hallway, and she was sad. She was there. We were talking. And we're walking down the hallway, and I kind of glanced down, and her hand was just dangling by her side with bright neon lights just flashing. Hold me, my heart's hurting, hold me. My heart's racing. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it. 1, 2, 3, go. No, 1, 2, 3. And I go exploring with my pinky. Right? And next thing I know, my pinky touched the backside of her hand. And next thing we know, we're holding hands and we're walking down the hallway. And I'm like, yeah, I got Stacy. She's an 8th grader. I'm cool. Like on the outside, I'm trying to be all cool. On the inside, like there's this whistles and blangs and clanging. And I mean, it just inside. Like, it was amazing. And it lasted a whole 2 weeks till she broke up with me and went back to Dio. That's the first girl's hand I ever held. And then a few years later, there's a girl that drove an hour and a half down to Temple, Texas, where I was preaching on a Sunday morning. She came with a group of college friends to hear me preach on the Sunday morning. Church I was on staff at, serving as a youth pastor. And then we went to eat lunch afterwards and went to Olive Garden, and she was sitting next to me. I was already lost in her eyes. Next thing I know, her knee bumps my knee underneath the table. And I'm going, yeah. So underneath the table, my little pinky goes exploring. And before you knew it, we were holding hands underneath the table. We were married 11 months later. And yesterday, we celebrated 23 years of married life. 23 years. I tell you that story because there's this human desire to be touched. And we don't know how long the leper had gone being untouched. But something about the touch of Jesus began to change the situation. Jesus touched him. When do you think was the last time that the leper had been touched? Remember, this man was physically and spiritually what the Jews would consider unclean. The last thing any Jew would want to do is to touch him. And even if allowed to, no one would want to, because the disease caused them to just be so visibly repulsive. Leprosy was more than just a skin disease. It meant isolation, total isolation, devastation, not just the physical pain, but the emotional pain of rejection. Your skin is rotting. They stink. They're deformed. They're forced to live outside of community. Keep 6 feet of distance between them and other people. A disease that affects your body and your emotions. Philip Yancey tells the story of Dr. Paul Brand, who was had spent his life devoted to treating patients of leprosy in the country of India. In the course of one examination, Dr. Brand laid his hand on a patient's shoulder and informed him through the help of a translator of what the treatments would be that lie ahead. And to the Dr. Brand's surprise, this man began to weep, like shoulders kind of heaving as he's weeping. And Dr. Brand looks at the translator and says, "Did I do something wrong?" And the translator starts talking to the patient, trying to quiz the patient on why he was so distraught. And eventually the message comes, and the translator tells Dr. Brand, he says, "You did nothing wrong. He's crying because you put your hand on his shoulder. And until you did, he hadn't been touched for years." Here's a man that for years had never known the sympathy of another human being. For years, he had to walk around separated from other people, keep everyone away from him. If he was a husband, he couldn't hold his wife's hand. If he was a father, he couldn't hold or hug his children. The leper who had approached Jesus on this day had probably not known the touch of another human for years. No wonder he was hesitant. No wonder he kind of came to Jesus and said, "Well, if you're willing, if you want to." See, the leper didn't question Jesus' power. He questioned Jesus' willingness. Could that be said of the lost and the broken of our cities today as they look at the church? Maybe they see the church, and when they think of the church, they might not have a vocabulary to say God or Jesus. God can help my marriage. Jesus can reach my children. But maybe they're thinking, I'm sure that this God has the power, but I wonder if that God is willing. The leper didn't question Jesus' power, he questioned his willingness. Mark tells us that Jesus was filled with compassion and reached out his hand and touched the man and immediately said, "I am willing," and his disease was cured. What was the result of Jesus' touch? Look at verse 42. It says, immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. I think there's two things that are happening here. Notice that Jesus healed the disease, and second, cleansed the leper, right? He healed him, that's physical, and then he was cleansed, that's the spiritual part of it. Now, here's the important part of God's touch. It's not just that God touches us, it's that God changes us. It's not just that God touches us, it's that God changes us. Why? Because whatever God touches, God changes. I'm that story. You're that story. Whatever God touches, he changes. He's changed me. That's why on the wall, way out here on the west side of the building, it says it's all about changed lives. My life and your life are lives that have been touched by the Master. He's changed us. We're not who we used to be. So can I just challenge you? Never quit when it looks impossible. Never quit when it looks impossible. Some things in our lives might seem impossible. Maybe your financial situation looks impossible. Maybe your health situation looks impossible. Maybe your marriage looks impossible. Maybe your lost prodigal children look impossible. Maybe your illness seems impossible. But I think too many miracles never come to pass because people quit believing with eyes of faith too early in the process. I think there's too many churches that haven't been birthed because the cities look too hard. Don't tell me that reaching the world is impossible. Don't tell me that there are languages that will never have a Bible translated in their language. I just don't accept that. That's why here at Life Church, we partner with one of our Kingdom Builder partners, Fire Bible. I just don't accept the fact that we can't rescue children from human trafficking. I just reject that idea that we can't put a dent in it. That's why we partner with ministries like Project Rescue to rescue children from human trafficking. Don't tell me that there are unreached people groups who will never hear the gospel. That's why we're partnering with Raising Up missionaries to go to unreached people groups in the Amazon basin jungles of South America and the Polynesian islands where people are waiting to hear the gospel for the very first time. Don't tell me that America is too difficult. It's too racially, politically, socially divided, that the gospel is too old and antiquated. I just will not settle for the fact that we can't make a dent and reach one more lost person with the hope of Jesus Christ and change their eternity forever. We can't quit, because one day we'll stand in front of the Jesus Christ who did not quit on us. Don't stop when things seem impossible. You see, being moved with compassion is simply doing the next kind thing in front of you. I want to tell you a story of Jacqueline Rogers. In 1926, 97 years ago. In 1926, a young 16-year-old girl got pregnant out of wedlock. That's not something you did in 1926. Frightened, distraught, the talk of the town, neglected. This frightened teenage girl carried this baby to term. And at the hospital, she surrendered and gave up her parental rights. In that same little town, there's a family, a couple, by the last name Miller. And the Millers were unable to have any children. And so the Millers adopted Jacqueline. And in the adoption records, they changed her name from Jacqueline to Irene. She became Irene Miller. The Millers went to the little small Assembly of God church in Sterling, Colorado. Irene Miller grew up in church. Sunday morning services, Wednesday night, midweek prayer, revivals. She grew up loving God. Eventually, she met a guy named Richard through mail correspondence. Richard had a nickname. They called him Dick. And they would write letters back and forth. And Dick was an airplane mechanic in the Navy stationed at Pearl Harbor. And as World War II was ending and winding down, the Navy moved him to Corpus Christi. Upon arrival in Corpus Christi, the Navy gave him a 2-week furlough. He thought, I might as well go to Sterling, Colorado and see this girl I've been writing letters to. See if she's as pretty as I imagine her in my mind. We don't know how he got from Corpus Christi to Sterling, Colorado. Maybe he bummed a ride off of a friend. Maybe he hitchhiked. Maybe he got on a bus. But he got to Sterling, Colorado, and he met Irene. 6 weeks later, they were married. He moved to Sterling, Colorado, and there began to work and build a family. Dick sensed a call of God on his life to go into ministry. Actually, let me tell you this story. This isn't part of the story. This is just a side note, but I think it's just too good to not miss. I told you 6 weeks later they got married. They got married on a Wednesday night. On a Wednesday, they took a bus to Denver, Colorado, checked into their hotel, and on their honeymoon wedding night, they walked a few blocks down to the Little Assembly of God Church because it was Wednesday, and on Wednesdays you go to midweek prayer. And they went to midweek prayer. They went to church on Wednesday of their wedding night, not because they had to, not because they were like so traditionalists, but because they realized that for two imperfect people to be married a lifetime, they needed to be intertwined with the God who was able to help them. They just loved Jesus that much. They loved Jesus. Honored Jesus, served Jesus. And when Dick felt a call of God on his life to go into ministry, at that point, the ministry training place was this place called Southwestern in Waxahachie, Texas. He was praying about going, talked with Irene, but here's the problem. Remember I told you that the Millers were not able to have any children. And so now, as the Millers were aging, Irene, their adopted daughter, was the sole caretaker to her parents. The one who would take them to doctor's appointments, the one who would get their prescriptions, the one who would get their groceries, the one who would look after them. Dick was kind of stuck in this dilemma. What do? I can't take Irene away from watching her parents. And he was in prayer, distraught one day, and he sensed the Lord say, if you will honor your wife's desire to care for her parents, I'll give you 2 sons for the ministry. Here's a picture. If you look up on the screens, probably around 1950s, early 1950s. On the left is James and Alice Miller. On the far right is Irene, now an adult, but that was their adopted daughter, and Dick, with 2 little boys there. Those boys would grow up. God said, I'll give you 2 boys for the ministry. Richard would become a pastor, and he'd build churches in Holly, Colorado, and Craig, Colorado. Eventually Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Shreveport, Louisiana. The younger one there, good looking because he looks like his own son, is Donald, who would become a missionary and plant churches in Argentina and Mexico and across Latin America. I just am stuck with the question, what would have happened if the Millers didn't reach out with a heart of compassion and adopt a frightened, overlooked, neglected teenage girl's daughter? What churches would have never been planted? Who would have never heard the gospel if the Millers didn't reach out with a heart of compassion and adopt a little orphaned girl? The Millers didn't know what would happen. They just reached out with compassion and did the next kind thing. But the story doesn't stop there. Eventually, Dick and Irene had a grandson that went into the ministry and planted a church in a little small town that nobody's ever heard of called, can you say it with me? Midlothian. I'm that grandson. I'm here today because the Millers in compassion adopted my grandma Reen. I'd even go so far as to say that 97 years ago, when the Millers adopted Grandma Reen, things began in motion for Life Church. But the story doesn't stop there. Not only did Dick and Irene have 2 sons in the ministry and a grandson in the ministry, but a great-grandson that today's a young adults pastor here at Life Church, Ethan, and another great-grandson that's new to Life Church, but Deuce, as he's studying for the ministry at Christ for the Nations. What would have happened? That's just my question. What would have happened if the Millers saw a need and just ignored it and kept on walking by? Because the story doesn't stop there. Because from the churches that Dick and Irene's 2 sons and grandson have pastored, hundreds of pastors and missionaries are now in ministry, and tens of thousands of people have heard the gospel. Here's my prayer, and this is what I've been praying for us this week. That we would live lives with compassion. That we wouldn't be so self-centered or self-focused. That we wouldn't be so overscheduled and so busy. That we would be willing to walk slowly through a crowd as Jesus would. And feel a compassion that would move us to an action. Because compassion is simply doing the next kind thing that's in front of you. Let me invite you to bow your head and close your eyes with me for just a moment.